Bob, would you like to respond?
I have a couple of responses to the responses, a little bit, not too much. You guys were really nice. But there's a couple of things. One thing a little bit mischievous, which is that one of your points, Tej, was that so-called first-person science would only deal with the subjective and could never, therefore could never be science, sort of. But perhaps you haven't noticed in reading Buddhist texts, which I can't blame you, that a natural byproduct of meditation at a certain point, what are called the 5 abhijñās, or sometimes the 6 abhijñās, which is a kind of also super knowing or different, you know, like unusual or extraordinary type of knowing, include the knowledge of others' minds, include a number of things, but particularly knowledge of others' minds. Now, that may be incredible to us, contrary to our conventional ideas, but in a way, otherwise, how does one assess how throughout the thousands of years of the Buddhist tradition, teachers have assessed the students' states of achievement, in meditation. It isn't only by their fruits you shall know them. There is that, of course, their behavior. But also, there is the idea that when you achieve a certain kind of clarity and focus, you can then know the minds of others. Just, it naturally comes. In fact, it's even taught in Buddhism that in many Buddhist texts, Abhidharma and stuff, that you should avoid that knowledge before you attain a deeper knowledge about the nature of suffering and the release from suffering, because it will become a distraction. Now, we know that mammals can empathize with their infants to a very, biologically, just naturally, where they more or less know the inner state of the infant in regard to essential things like hunger and so forth. And lovers, we hear in poetry that lovers, and maybe we've had a momentary experience ourselves of empathy. And so why would it in principle not be possible that you could train an observer through contemplative training to have a different perception? And this relates again to being more imaginative about the future of science, I think, in the line of what you were saying. I mean, a scientist today is, or anyone who comes to this school, it's sort of assumed they come in with an IQ, they have a SAT score, and then they pump in a bunch of information, they learn some axioms, formulas, they read this and that book, and they become capable of gabbing about deconstruction or about reconstruction or whatever. And then they're supposed to be very highly educated, write some papers. But their basic cognitive structure has not changed. They're still whatever they came in with. They kind of grow up, they get beaten up a little bit, but they're the same. And we don't have any way of training or addressing directly their cognitive state. We don't train them in yoga, we don't train them in meditation, we don't train them to develop stability of mind. We assume that someone who's learning French or Sanskrit is going to develop concentration to memorize many grammatical paradigms. Professor Tubb would take it highly amiss if they did not know bhavami, bhavazi, bhavati, etc. Lots of paradigms. So they go through different things, but still, and so in that maybe develop more concentration, but there's no direct change of mind as instructed, okay? But why wouldn't that be possible in the future? Like you have to train someone to use a microscope or a telescope or interpret data from a computer readout of an electron accelerator or whatever. That all takes a lot of training. Then mathematics is an elaborate algebra, all this kind of thing. Tremendous amount of training. Why shouldn't there be? I think what Alan and others are talking about in first-person science is not just sitting and listening to people babble about what they had for breakfast or how it feels in their stomach. It's developing more highly trained people who can understand their own mental states and who even conceivably could understand the mental states of others, which could be collectively judged, not just by the implanting of external machines, but by developing higher degrees of empathy and insight. So that's one point. That's one point. Just to think more broadly about what science could be, and in regard to how to verify things in another way. Second point you made, which also is very good, I'm glad you brought up, is the idea of science as an artifact, a community, sort of the Kuhnian thing, community of agreement, different layers of convention, historical in a context and so on. And of course, Buddhism tends to be thought of as, a couple of yogis and a few lamas and a roshi or two wandering to the west, and like setting up a little meditation center or something. And whatever happened in Asia, we don't know. But actually, thousands of years, big universities, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students, faculties, literatures, self-exploding hypotheses, such as Professor Taub introduced us to, and all evaluating of different people and all sorts of things. So you have a growing community which has left a huge literature, enormous literature, like 10 or 100 libraries of Alexandria. So again, first-person science means maybe taking into account that whole literature. In the case of, people always say this thing about how Wundt, or whatever his name was, disgraced introspectionism or something before Freud. Well, that's just one German guy, like he's probably cold in Leipzig with no central heating and whatever, people have bad digestion, eating too much Schlagsahne, whatever. The point is, there's thousands of years of reports of subjective states in institutions, in communities of convention, and why shouldn't that be something given parity, and intellectual respect and parity, and studied in a similar way? So therefore we have also, so we have the meeting. My point in saying that Buddhism is as much a science, or more science even, than religion, and therefore should interact with Western science the same way it interacts with Western religion. In interreligious dialogue, there should be interscientific dialogue, rather than that the Buddhists are just new subjects for our Western scientific measurements and so forth. That's just my point. And so that the Dalai Lama, for example, his interest and fascination in science is not just his personal idiosyncrasy, it's actually a natural thing about the encounter of the civilizations, you could say.
Can I respond to that?
Oh yeah, well, I had one more point, but...
Okay, I'll take the whole thing.
Well, no, the other one is not for you, so you respond to those two things. Sure.
Yeah, I only wrote this over a 2-week period, so I'm not real attached to being, any of the points in this. But one of the points I was trying to make was that the kind of reports you're talking in the text should be considered one of these cases where Buddhism has similarities to science, that this idea that we can create something called a first-person science, particularly as Chalmers has defined it, is forlorn. And so I was thinking, yes, we do need to rely on the texts. Now, this other idea of yours about, we could conceivably develop some sort of perception of other people's states. If you look at the traditional Western idea of how we become aware of other people's states, it, was mostly articulated by Hume, where, I've got this sort of sensation, and then there's this a feeling, and then, I vibrate in a certain way, and you vibrate another way, and so, I've got a feeling in my head, and it travels across the room and makes a copy in your head. I don't feel very happy with that description of what's going on, and I feel very strongly that the idea that knowledge consists of, and our perception consists of making a copy of the outside world in our head is seriously mistaken. And I think, given that there are causal connections between my feelings and your feelings, I don't think there's any reason to assume that we're having two different feelings. I think that if you say, if they're hooked up that way, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that it's not that I'm having a copy of your feeling. You and I are having the same feeling. And I have no problem with that idea at all, but I would guess that an awful lot of other people probably
would. Of course they would.
Yeah.
But the main thing is that people who live in their discursive mind and inner monologue, verbalizing all the time, and feel that's it. Resist being trained, and I know myself, resist the training of learning how to deal with their own inner voices in a different way.
Yeah.
Which is what meditation does, and systematic contemplative training, therefore, is something that I think the future will hold for a lot of those people.
Oh yeah,
without a doubt.
And for developing any kind of knowing how skills, particularly when you were talking about, being able to develop mathematical skills, I think there's far too little of that in pedagogy. We just say, oh, certain people have math ability, others don't, you know, and some of the knowledge of something like the Buddhist introspective techniques would, I think, increase our abilities to teach people to know how to learn science. And that's something I think we could learn from the contemplative tradition.
Okay, good. Then the third thing I just wanted to say about Gary's thing about memorizing aphorisms in the Buddhist educational tradition, the universities of India and Tibet, at least that I know about, particularly, a little bit less in East Asia perhaps, but in those traditions, the memorizing of text is, of course, really critical. So in my thing about encouraging Chris to defy authority, I wasn't saying that there isn't a lot of aphorisms and things that are learned, because that's that paradoxical point. George perhaps you know, experience, or what they translate as perception, pratyaksha, what is called pratyaksha. In epistemology, even the sort of the most seemingly high-tech element of Buddhist thought, the logic epistemology thing, the direct experience, which is unarticulable verbally, is the more real one, and it is cognition. You know, it is not non-cognition because it's indeterminate for the Buddhist. The Nyayikas, that's their complaint about it, is that if you can't articulate it, then you don't have it. Do you know what I mean? But from the Buddhist point of view, direct experience is the one that's in contact with actual reality, so you're being more real and more efficient causally when you can't say what you're doing than when you later go and live in your interpretation and try to describe it.
Yeah.
And therefore, that means that in their logic and epistemology, there's an a priori disclaimer of the possibility of an absolute dogmatic description of any sort of logical operation, and therefore, that doesn't shut down the philosophers in trying to describe these things, but that opens the door for infinite more and more sophisticated discussions of language and logic and this and that, all knowing that the real thing is to get back to direct experience of reality and to try to disassociate the fact that most of us live in our heads and we can't distinguish between my concept paper, words on paper, etc., and something amazing of looking at this, which would maybe only a poet would know, like holding this crazy thing, like Thich Nhat Hanh, he would see here all the forests, you know, of North America, and like some sawmills and some trucks and some weirdo capitalist. And
Infinity in a grain of sand, and eternity in an hour.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So anyway, I just wanted to put that in, that there is a lot of this thing, but then they all do tend to be self-transcending in the tradition, just as Gary said.
Well, one of the things I was going to put in that I left out of this draft is that in many ways I think you have to see the artifact of science is defined by the function it's supposed to perform, and I think that the function that the artifact is supposed to perform isn't to enable us to achieve a certain kind of wisdom. Sure. But you have to make a difference between the artifact and, you know, the state of mind that the artifact is designed to create. That was really largely what I was trying to say.
And maybe the encounter with the Buddhist scientific tradition and the Western one could help the Western one overcome a certain pre-imposed self-limitation that we can't know certain things, and we only can just explore this thing or measure that thing.
That the artifact is all that there is.
That could be challenged.
Yeah,
Yeah, that could be challenged by the encounter.
Did you want to say something?
Comments? We could take just a moment here if there are any of the other panelists from other panels here on the front row who would like to make a comment. We could do that before we take some of the other questions. We have some roving
Grab a
mics.
mic. Take off your coat, George, and grab a mic.
This is a question to Pete, actually. I really like the idea of the 3 levels of discourse, and the idea that at this 3rd level, one can really engage into a fruitful dialogue that you kind of envisioned. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more. What would it entail? And how, to be more specific, how would it differ from the Husserlian method of simply bracketing off theories and just looking at the phenomenology? If you could elaborate a bit more, yeah. Because it's very appealing to me, because one of the things that I'm personally concerned in this kind of interdisciplinary dialogue is that given the fact that when it comes to discussions of reality, unavoidably and implicitly, most of us somehow assume the dominance of scientific language and scientific paradigm. So there is a danger that, that certain Buddhist insights and understanding and framework could be reduced into, a kind of a scientific framework and scientific discourse, and I'm personally very, wary of that kind of danger. So this 3rd level of discourse that discussion that you envisioned seems to hold something quite interesting. So if you could elaborate a bit more.
Well, that's really a challenge, but I brought it on myself by starting to talk about it, so I'll try to follow up on the challenge. Let's see what I can say in just a few words. So we can look at the pillar as a solid object, we can look at it as consciousness, in the sense that the pillar is given in our experience, and what we experience is, by definition, the experience of the pillar. That's not so difficult, and that is what Husserl tried to do with his epoche. And he pointed out that most of his students didn't get it. And he told his students, you have to do that for a few months and then something else will happen. But they all went out and wrote about it in a more intellectual way, most of them. But you can really work with that for a few months, and you really get a sense of the difference between seeing a pillar as solid and seeing a pillar as experience of consciousness. But to see a pillar as presence, as being, to really focus on the presence of everything, it is something which artists have a much better way to talk about. I mean, seeing the world in a grain of sand, for example. And all of us have experiences like that. And they come occasionally for often no particular reason. But the challenge is to recognize those experiences and to cultivate them. And as soon as they slip by and become memory, then once they are memories, then they are back in the normal stratum. And the danger of art and poetry is also that they are being encapsulated. So art and poetry can be a help, and it can also be a hindrance by co-opting it. So if I just, I mean, the really honest answer is, if I talk from my personal experience, I mean, this is something I've been struggling with for a large fraction of my life. And if you would have asked me 3 years ago, I would have tried to give you an eloquent answer, because somehow there was a point in my life 3 years ago. Until then, I was firmly convinced that any knowledge I had of any type, scientific, everyday life, contemplative, whatever, that any knowledge I could simplify and give in a nutshell to anybody, and then if they wanted to know more, I could say more. If you'd never seen an airplane, you can say it's like a bird, but, well, it doesn't flap, and it's a little bit bigger, and you can go on as an approximation, but you can always start with something simple. And I was sort of proud of that. I thought, oh, well, you know, why can other people not do that? That's strange, but somehow I don't seem to have any difficulty doing that. But then 3 years ago, I realized, to my great surprise, that something went wrong in a completely unexpected way. It was not that I started to have experience which I could not explain. That part stayed the same. The surprising change was that I started to have really important insights for which the best explanation sounded exactly the same as I would have said a number of years before, when I didn't see it so clearly. So then I began to realize, sort of like vividly, on a embodied level, to my shock, that suddenly I couldn't explain it because the explanation would be misunderstood. The simplest example I can think of, and that is almost a caricature, but just to give a feeling, is that if somebody says, oh, it's nice weather today, there is one meaning. And then if that person has a terrible disease and almost dies, and then sort of just makes it again, and then says, oh, it's nice weather today, there's a completely different meaning for that person than first, but the words are exactly the same. So in a way, I have to say, I cannot answer you. But in a way, I can talk about the way I cannot answer, and I can describe the way in which collectively we can try to add experiment to theory. And if this is going to really take off in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, this dialogue between ways of knowing, there has to be an experiential part to that, and theory just doesn't cut it.
Alan?
Can I say something just quick to respond to Pierre on this very point?
Oh.
I don't want to
Yeah,
interrupt.
oh.
Because the question came up of the relationship to Husserl, and I think there's a very natural transition in the phenomenological tradition, because if you think what happens next in Heidegger, coming out of German Romantic tradition, which I think connects maybe with your third mode of experience, presentness, part of what Heidegger was saying was wrong was that he wanted to recapture a kind of primordial openness to being. And of course, Heidegger very much read Eastern texts. I mean, this was a part of his influence. And so I wonder whether or not you see any resonance between this third state that you're suggesting to us, and that one which comes out of 19th century, whether it's the sublime or the transcendental or the romantic, and then finds a manifestation in Heidegger's later phenomenology in rejecting the Husserlian approach and saying there needs to be this openness to being.
Thank you. This started off as a very interesting no self, or at least no other experience, because we were all wondering who was talking, because with the sound system, it was not clear where it came from. But yes, Heidegger and Husserl form a very, very interesting juxtaposition, because the method of presentation is so different. Husserl started off as a mathematician, actually as an astronomer first, then became a mathematician and then a philosopher. And Heidegger started off in a more theologian-like way, and they used that approach. Husserl only wanted to say what he could argue from basics, and Heidegger was happy to just jump in and give his deepest feeling about this crossed-out being, etc. So I do think that Heidegger had a real intuition of what I was trying to talk about. When I read it, it sort of like jumps out of the pages, that is clear. But it is like an island, it is like a little opening in the clouds, you don't know how he gets to it. He makes parallels with all kind of previous traditions, but he doesn't tell you how he gets to it. Husserl tells you a little bit more, and if you read Husserl's briefwechsel, his letters, then he says a lot more. Then he tells his friends and his family and his students what he doesn't want to write in official literature, and he tells them that there are all kinds of intuitions he has. He cannot yet connect with his basic premises, but I'm convinced that from reading the letters that he had a similar sense as what Heidegger had, and I think that Heidegger got a lot from him as well as from the Eastern sources. He was just much more of a public speaker, and he's willing to just throw it out there. But science, as opposed to art, science is a multi-generational enterprise, and each generation adds a little bit, and it's very slow, but then it can be integrated and people can continue. In that sense, Husserl was a scientist and Heidegger definitely was not. And I think the Husserlian tradition in some way or other is just waiting to be taken up again and then slowly carried forward.
Alan?
Pete, as far as I know, I think you're the only physicist on the panel, so the iron is hot. Oh, you are, of course, Paul, but you haven't been speaking as a panelist. But either one of you, but since Pete, either one actually, we've heard this term physical being used very nonchalantly, actually all day, as if we actually know what it means. And my impression is that a lot of psychologists, perhaps neuroscientists, when they're using the term, they're using it exactly as if we're still living in 1879 when the scientific study of the mind ostensibly began. That is, the physical is constituted by particles and fields and their properties. But as you know, from 1887, the whole mechanical explanation of fields fell away. And then from the advent of quantum mechanics, now we have things like probability waves, which may be collapsing. If they do collapse, there's no physical mechanism for the collapse of the probability wave from a purely informational state to an actual physical reality. Since 1915, we have space-time actually influencing configurations of mass energy. And then if we move ahead to M theory, now we have 11 dimensions, most of which nobody ever perceives, and which there's no empirical evidence whatsoever. There may be one day, but we don't know. So in this whole bandwidth, it looks like we have kind of a physicalism of the gaps, analogous to the God of the gaps of the theists. If you don't understand it, well, God did it. And it looked like we're in a similar situation now. If we don't know what mental states really are, well, of course, they must be physical. We don't know which one. We haven't even identified the neural correlates of consciousness, but of course it must be physical. So as a physicist, either one of you, maybe you can team up here. What do you mean by physical? What constitutes physical as opposed to non-physical?
Well, I can give two completely different answers. And let me give the card-carrying physicist answer first, and then I'll hide my card. The card-carrying answer is, yes, this is really fascinating, and indeed, the fact that you can speak on the mic, that happens through electromagnetic waves, the wireless transmission. And electromagnetic waves are waves which don't have a medium in which they are waving. The ether is tossed out as an unnecessary assumption. We don't know where the waves are occurring in, but they are occurring, and we know the properties of the waves. So all of physics has gone from ontology to epistemology, if you want. Elementary particles are described by their properties, and no physicist wonders about what they really are beyond their properties. It's all described in terms of what happens. In that sense, physics has become phenomenology too. The notion of phenomenology is a very interesting one, and it's changing in many ways. So already as a card-carrying physicist, I would say, yes, you're absolutely right, and Bob also started off with that. Everything is already dissolved. In quantum mechanics, things, in a sense, don't really exist until they are measured. John Wheeler talked about the game of 20 questions. It's by measuring something that something comes out, and there is not a unique answer before you see it. So all of that is true. But let me give a second answer, which is much more radical. And the much more radical answer is, well, the previous story was the story within the first of the three stages. The stage in which we look at nature, which is already remarkably dissolvable under quantum mechanics and everything. But that means that we have already started up and taken our stage on a particular stage, our place on a particular stage. And if you watch a movie, or if you would be able to analyze something in a dream or whatever, but let's take a movie. If you watch a movie, and if you want to talk about where the light comes from in a movie, then every light in the movie comes either from the sun or a lamp or whatever. But both the dark and the light places in the movie are really projected by the projector. So if we now talk about where the light comes from in a certain scene in a movie, it depends, I mean, what you mean. And the second answer would be to step out of the movie and to talk about the projector. And that is not something which is normally done in physics of today. I think it will be done in physics a few hundred years from now, but because it has to be continuous and multi-generational, I think this will be at least a few hundred years, if not quite a bit later.
Add just a little comment and just turn around from Pete's very nice description on the three levels and the third level in which we're merely in a state of being and not projecting onto that some concept. If we start from that position, that's a very honest position, which is, I think is particularly nice about it, because these are the things we can certainly say is what our perception is. Beyond that, we move into other systems of thought that we draw from in making our statements. But if we start with Pete's third position, then we can come backwards at the problem of physics and ask what it is particular from that state, if we assume that that's our starting point, how we come back from that to something like physics. And one of the qualities I think that you would say is that we have a certain ease of agreement. So there's a relative ease with which we can repeat experiments and so forth, and so we have a certain easiness of getting to agreement. Now, we could argue that agreement is merely an illusionary agreement, that it's merely a decision. But then we also have to add the fact, as Pete said, that over periods of time we can carry forth certain knowledge that has a certain repeatability. So I think there is a path towards understanding what physical means. I don't know that I have the answer to it, but I think that some of what Pete said tonight might help in that direction.
Can I add one more short thing, and then I'll give it up to the rest? I think one of the fundamental problems is that if you start consciously or unconsciously with the normal way the world is given, then what does it mean to get wisdom, to be enlightened, to see through, to get more understanding? Take this example of a movie. if you look at the movie is a two-dimensional play of light from the projector with a certain meaning, with a certain story. And if you watch the movie, you fall into the movie and it becomes three-dimensional and real. And that is how we enjoy the movie. And if somebody would be watching the movie and would for some reason not know it would be a movie, and if you then have to point out that it is a movie, then they will ask you, well, what does it mean that everything is light? They have these three-dimensional buildings and all these solid things, and you say it is all light. So they would think that the three-dimensional objects they think they see on the screen can be dissolved in light. But actually, it is the two-dimensional patterns which are given by light, which are interpreted as three-dimensional things, and which are then mistaken. So if somebody tells you, you have to see through it, don't start with the world as it is given and try to sort of dissolve everything in light, and the pillow becomes light and everything. That is the wrong attitude, since you have already jumped too far. You have to go back to a more earlier, rudimentary way before you can talk about how you can have a different types of insight. Well, this requires much more than a few minutes, but maybe in a future meeting.
Oh, we have another comment. Okay.
Yes, I normally speak from the standpoint of the three H's, Husserl, Heidegger, and Hegel. But I'd like to play the devil's advocate for a moment. I have not heard anything about the status of mathematical entities. We've talked a great deal about the experiential component and various phenomenological matters. But after all, the West began with Pythagoras' claim that the world is made of number. And I should like to know how that, something about the ontological status of number. I don't think we want to think of it as etiolated matter, subtle matter. I wonder if anyone would care to comment on the status of mathematical entities, particularly since artificial life theorists are making so much of it.
From the Buddhist perspective, a mathematical language is another conventional language system, and it's actually considered part of the outer sciences in India. You know, there are the inner sciences and the outer sciences, and therefore mathematics is useful for engineering, construction, astronomy, this sort of thing, and therefore it's considered a very necessary language, also conventional for the outer sciences, I think you would say, in India. Right? Jyotishi, it connects very much with astronomy, I think, in India, right?
It connects in a practical way with
Yes.
astronomy and architecture and things like that. But
Right.
much of the intellectual place that numbers have in the West is taken up by grammar
Right.
in India, and things that we would think of expressing in mathematical ways, they express through complicated grammatical technicalities. So
Right.
it's a different system.
But a higher order conventionalism would be the both, I think, Buddhist and Hindu way of thinking. Well, Hindus might say that the language was not conventional because it's the body of Brahma or something. Some of them, right? The grammar, the alphabet is Devanagari, but mathematics is a higher order conventionalism, I think. Therefore, the mysticism of mathematics, that somehow these 11 dimensions are going to be discovered 50 years from now, and then the boys will have control of the universe through understanding the 11 dimensions, would be considered delusional from the Buddhist point of view.
And from the Nayayika point of view, although Steve or George could talk about this, better numbers are somewhat of an embarrassment as properties, because the role of individual psychology in the production of numbers has to be recognized, but it's inconvenient, isn't it?
Well, I can't resist because my name starts with an H too, like Husserl, Hegel, and Heidegger. I am not a German philosopher. I'm neither German nor philosopher, but I'm Dutch and I do read German, and I like all three of them to read them. But my answer would be that I think numbers appeal so much because extracting numbers from experience is a way to get an invariant which seems to have a reality in itself, independently of the substrate where you take it from. Just like phenomenology can extract phenomena independently whether you see things as material object or as experience or as just awareness. So I think mathematics, in a sense, it's not surprising that it was in a number of cultures part of a contemplative tradition.
One other thing that just in the gap here, unless someone else is speaking, Susan Carey earlier brought up the idea of what she called the core knowledge that was discovered in infants by empirical experimentation as questioning the experiential, conceptual, or the linguistic, non-linguistic, conceptual, perceptual dichotomy in George's language, using perception for experience or pratyaksha. And I just thought it would be amusing and intriguing maybe to use scientific and Western philosophy types, that Dharmakirti himself uses the pre-linguistic knowledge of infants as a proof of previous lives, as an evidence for previous lives. And particularly he chooses the infants going for the breast, that an infant knows how to do that. And so these things which would be considered genetic imprinting without language, they would have been language knowledge in previous lives. And that would go for apes and everything, since apes were tenured professors once in a previous life. All apes and all animals in that view. So it's presented as that core knowledge thing. They get out of having their thing questioned of that dichotomy by saying there was language knowledge in previous lives, but language was misused in those lives. And therefore, they're now like being experimented upon by scientists in Colombia, the poor apes, at this moment. I thought that was fun, so I'm sorry.
Any other comments? We have some wonderful questions here, but my sense is that wisdom dictates we begin to end today's session. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone again. It was a long day, and people showed enormous stamina today, and hope you all enjoyed it as much as I know I did. I'd like to invite you back tomorrow morning. The panels will start promptly at 8:30, so if you can get here a little bit before that, 8 or 8:15, that would be great. And so we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Then one last comment, if the panelists would come up to the stage for a brief meeting just for a couple moments. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul.